The Galactic Senate chamber was the biggest room in the known universe. Not because of its physical size, though it was enormous, a dome wide enough to hold 40,000 delegates from 800 species. It was big because of what happened inside it. Wars were started here. Wars were ended here. Whole civilizations had been saved or destroyed by the words spoken beneath this golden ceiling. And today, for the first time in 300 years, every single seat was filled. The reason was simple. The humans had finally responded. Ambassador Vethkal of the Draconid Imperium sat near the front of the chamber, his long scaled neck stretched tall, his yellow eyes scanning the crowd with practiced calm. Around him, delegates from the Kesari Union, the Valari Collective, the Mrak Dominion, and dozens of smaller states buzzed with quiet conversation. Everyone was nervous. Everyone was pretending they were not. The humans had been discovered 14 years ago. A slow-moving explorer vessel from the Kesari Union had picked up radio signals from a small blue planet in the outer rim, signals that were clearly organized, clearly intelligent, and clearly coming from a species that had no idea it was being watched. The Galactic Senate had spent the next 12 years debating what to do. Some wanted to make contact immediately. Others wanted to wait. A few wanted to quietly leave and never come back. Those few had been ignored. That, Vethkal now thought, may have been the first mistake. Contact had been made 2 years ago. The humans had reacted with shock, then disbelief, then something the universal translation systems had struggled to process. The closest word it could produce was excitement. They had sent back greetings in 40 languages. They had asked questions, thousands of questions, about the galaxy, about other species, about trade and science and culture. They had been almost overwhelmingly enthusiastic. Nobody had asked them about their military. That seemed, in hindsight, like a significant oversight. The great doors at the south end of the chamber opened, and the human delegation walked in. There were 12 of them, dressed in dark formal clothing that was simple by galactic standards, but carried something about it, a kind of quiet confidence that Vithkiel had noticed the first time he had met humans in person. They did not look at the crowd the way most new species did. They did not shrink under 40,000 sets of eyes. They walked like they had walked into rooms like this before, even though they had not. At the front of the delegation was the human ambassador, a woman named Elena Vasquez. She was small by human standards, Vethkal had been told, but she carried herself like someone who had never been small in any way that mattered. Beside her walked a man in a different kind of clothing, darker, more structured, with decorations on his chest that the Senate's cultural analysis team had identified as military honors. His name had been listed in the briefing files as General Marcus High. He had not been part of the original diplomatic team. His presence here today had been requested specifically by the human government. Nobody in the Senate knew exactly why. The Senate's grand arbiter, a massive Velhari elder named Chorus of Still Waters, raised 3 of her 6 arms for silence. The chamber went quiet. We welcome the human delegation to the 144th emergency session of the Galactic Senate, she said, her voice moving through the translation systems in 800 languages at once. This session has been called in response to the formal complaint filed by the Mrak Dominion, the Kesari Union, and 11 associated states regarding the construction activities detected in the Outer Veil star systems, which fall within contested territorial claims. The human government has been invited to address these concerns directly. Ambassador Vasquez stepped to the speaking platform. She looked out at the sea of alien faces, scales and feathers and smooth gray skin and eyes in every color, and she smiled. It was a small smile, calm. Thank you, Grand Arbiter. Thank you to the full Senate for receiving us. Her voice was steady and clear. The Human Confederation acknowledges the concerns raised by our neighbors. We understand that our activity in the outer veil has caused alarm. We would like to explain what we have been building and why. There was a shift in the chamber. Delegates leaned forward slightly. This was the question everyone had been asking for 8 months, ever since long-range sensors had detected massive construction operations being carried out by human vessels across 6 uninhabited star systems. The structures were large, very large, and they were clearly not civilian infrastructure. The Human Confederation has been building a defense network, Vasquez said simply. A system of fortified stations, early warning arrays, and rapid response platforms positioned along the borders of what we consider our sovereign territory. We have not violated any agreed boundary lines. We have operated entirely within systems that were unclaimed at the time of our initial territorial registration. We have broken no law. The noise that rose from the chamber was not quite an uproar, but it was close. Vethkal heard the delegate from the Mrak Dominion, a bristling insectoid named Krethshal, making sharp clicking sounds that the translator rendered as formal protest language. Several of the smaller state delegates were already talking urgently among themselves. Horus of Still Waters raised her arms again. The Senate acknowledges the statement. However, the scale of the construction has raised questions about the nature and purpose of these installations. The Mrak Dominion, in particular, has raised the concern that a defensive network of this size implies preparation for offensive operations. Can the human delegation speak to this? Vasquez nodded. Yes, and this is why we asked to bring General Halle today. He can speak to these matters with more technical precision than I can. She stepped aside. General Marcus Halle walked to the platform. He was not the most impressive-looking being in the room. He was a middle-aged human male, gray at the temples, with a face that looked like it had seen difficult weather for a long time. He had no translator implants. He spoke through the platform's standard system. He placed both hands flat on the railing in front of him, looked out at the chamber, and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to be honest with you. All of you. Because I think honesty is more useful right now than diplomacy. The chamber was completely silent. Humanity has been a spacefaring civilization for just under 60 years. In that time, we've had contact with the wider galaxy for 2. In those 2 years, we've learned a great deal. We've learned about your history, your conflicts, your political structures. We've studied the wars you fought. We've studied how species rise and fall in this galaxy. He paused. And we've made some decisions based on what we learned. Vethkal felt something cold move through him. He was not sure why. The defense network in the outer veil is real, Halle continued. It is large. And I will tell you plainly, it is not finished. When it is finished, it will be the most comprehensive border defense system ever constructed by any known civilization in this galaxy. He let that sit for a moment. Not because we plan to attack anyone, but because we studied your history, and we saw what happens to civilizations that cannot defend themselves. We have no intention of becoming an example of that pattern. The silence in the chamber had a different quality now. It was not the silence of boredom or routine. It was the silence of 40,000 beings suddenly paying extremely close attention. I also want to say something else, Halle said. Something I think the Senate should understand clearly. Before any decisions are made about how to respond to our construction activities. He looked out across the chamber, slowly, like he was making sure he was seen. Humans are not a peaceful species by nature. We made ourselves peaceful over a very long time, through a great deal of suffering. That process changed us, but it did not erase what we came from. We remember what we are capable of. We remember it clearly. He straightened slightly. We are not a threat to anyone who does not make the mistake of becoming a threat to us. But any government in this chamber that is considering whether to press the issue of our construction program through means other than diplomacy should factor that. understanding into their calculations. Very carefully. The chamber did not explode into noise. It did something more unusual. It stayed silent. Completely, absolutely silent. For nearly 30 seconds, 40,000 delegates from 800 species said nothing at all. Vethkal realized, in that silence, that he was holding his breath. He was not alone. The silence in the Senate chamber broke slowly, like ice cracking at the edge of a frozen lake, one sound at a time, and all at once. What followed was not argument. It was something closer to controlled panic, disguised as formal procedure. Chorus of Still Waters called for a recess. She rarely did that. In 400 years of serving as Grand Arbiter, she had called for emergency recesses exactly 6 times. This was the 7th. The delegate corridors behind the main chamber filled immediately with the sound of 100 different species talking at the same time in 100 different languages. Vethkal moved quickly, cutting through a cluster of Kesari officials, with their pale translucent heads bent together in urgent conference. Stepping around a group of smaller Velhari delegates, who were already connected to their home communications, network through their headsets, he found who he was looking for near the Eastern Corridor. High Commander Drethvos of the Mrak Dominion Military Advisory Staff. Drethvos was tall, even by Mrak standards, and he stood against the wall with his forearms folded and his compound eyes moving steadily across the crowd, the way a predator watches. Open ground. Vethkal approached and kept his voice low. What did your analysts make of it? Drethvos did not look at him. Our analysts are divided. Half believe the general's statement was a performance, a calculated display meant to establish dominance in the negotiation. The other half believe he was simply telling the truth. Which half do you agree with? Now Drethvos looked at him. I agree with the half that says it does not matter which one it is. That was not a comforting answer, and Drethvos clearly knew it, because he said nothing more. Vethkal stood there for a moment, then turned and walked toward the human delegation's assigned waiting room. He had a reason to go. The Draconian Imperium and the Human Confederation had a small but functional trade, relationship minerals from the outer rim systems the humans had registered. In exchange for navigational data, the Imperium had accumulated over centuries. It was not a close partnership, but it was a real one. It gave him a reason to knock. The door opened. Ambassador Vasquez looked at him without surprise, which meant she had been told he was coming, which meant the humans were monitoring the corridor foot traffic. Small detail. Interesting detail. Ambassador Vethkal, she said. Please come in. The waiting room was modest by Senate standards. The human delegation had arranged their equipment and personal items with a neatness that bordered on precise. General Halle was seated at a small table, reviewing something on a flat display screen. He looked up when Vethkal entered, but did not stand. Vethkal sat across from them. He chose his words carefully. I want to understand the general's statement in the chamber. Not politically. I mean technically. The claim that your defense network will be the most comprehensive ever constructed. Your civilization has been spacefaring for 60 years. The Kesari have been spacefaring for 11,000. The math is difficult to accept. Vasquez and Halle exchanged a brief look. It lasted less than a second. Vethkal had learned, over the past 2 years, that humans communicated enormous amounts of information in very brief facial expressions. He had not yet learned to read them accurately. Halle set down his display. Ambassador, let me ask you something. In 11,000 years of spacefaring civilization, how many total wars has the Kesari Union fought? Vethkal fought. The historical record shows approximately 430 major conflicts by Kesari classification standards. And what was the longest single war? The succession conflict of the Fourth Era, approximately 900 years. Halle nodded slowly. Humanity fought its last large-scale global war on Earth approximately 80 years ago. In the 6,000 years before that, we fought continuously. Not occasionally, continuously. Every generation, somewhere on our planet, a war was happening. Sometimes many wars at the same time. We developed military technology not as a specialized discipline. We developed it the way other species develop farming or architecture. It was a survival requirement. He paused. We stopped fighting each other, not because we ran out of reasons to fight. We stopped because we developed enough shared fear of what we could do to each other that cooperation became more rational than conflict. That fear was earned. Vethkal was quiet for a moment. You are saying that your people are uniquely experienced in war. I'm saying our people have spent more of our history at war than any civilization I've read about in your galactic records. And the records your Senate maintains are thorough. Hale folded his hands on the table. The structures in the outer veil were designed by people who grew up in institutions that had been refining military theory for over 6,000 years. Not 6,000 years of occasional conflict. 6,000 years of consistent, serious, evolving warfare against opponents who were trying just as hard to win as we were. The result is a way of thinking about defense and offense that is different. How different? Vethkal asked. Hale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Put it this way. When your Senate's military analysis teams looked at our construction in the outer veil, what did they see? Large stations, energy collection arrays, what appeared to be weapons platforms, and long-range sensor systems. They saw the parts we wanted them to see," Hale said. "The parts we didn't want them to see, they haven't found yet." The room was quiet. Vethkal looked at Vasquez. She was watching him with an expression he had learned to read, not hostile, not threatening, honest. She was being honest with him because she wanted him to understand something important. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because the Draconid Imperium has been a fair partner," Vasquez said. "And because what happens in the next few weeks is going to matter a great deal. The Mrak Dominion is pushing the Senate toward a resolution that would classify our construction as a threat to galactic stability. If that resolution passes, it authorizes a joint inspection force, which is a polite way of saying a military delegation, to enter the outer veil and audit our installations. And if that happens, then we will have to make a decision," Hale said, "about whether we allow it." Vethkal understood what he was not saying. "And if you do not allow it, then the Senate will have to make a decision about what to do about that," Hale said. "And I would prefer very much that we not get to that point, because the decision the Senate makes will tell us what kind of galaxy we're living in. And the decision we make in response will tell the Senate what kind of species we are." He paused. "I have spent my entire career trying to prevent wars. I know what the early stages look like. And I know that the most dangerous moment in any conflict is not the fighting. It's the moment before the fighting, when everyone is still making assumptions about what the other side will and will not do." He leaned forward slightly. "We want the Senate to have accurate assumptions." Vethkal sat very still. He was processing a great many things at once, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that he was several steps behind a conversation that had been planned long before he walked through the door. "What do you want from the Draconid Imperium?" he finally asked. Vasquez answered, "We want you to vote against the inspection resolution, and we want you to encourage 3 other mid-tier powers to do the same. That's enough to block it under Senate voting rules. In exchange, full technical specifications on the outer veil installations, shared with the Imperium only, under a sealed diplomatic agreement. Everything, including the parts the Senate's analysts haven't found." Vethkal looked at her for a long moment. "You would show us everything." "We would show you everything," she confirmed. Because we want at least one major power in this Senate to understand exactly what it is that the Mrak Dominion is considering pushing the galaxy toward. We think once your people see the full picture, the calculus becomes very clear. Vethkal stood slowly. His scales had gone a slightly deeper shade of gold, which among draconids was a sign of serious, concentrated thought. He looked at Hale. The general's warning in the chamber today, was that directed at the Mrak Dominion specifically? Hale met his eyes. It was directed at anyone who needed to hear it. Vethkal left the room without another word. He walked back through the busy corridor, past the clusters of delegates and the hum of a dozen ongoing political crises, and he thought about 6,000 years of unbroken war. He thought about a species that had made itself peaceful through suffering. He thought about what it meant that such a species was now, quietly and methodically, building something in the outer dark that the galaxy's best military analysts had only partially seen. And he thought about the general's eyes when he spoke. Calm, completely calm. The eyes of someone who was not making a threat. The eyes of someone who was explaining a fact. By the time he reached the Draconid delegation's communications room, he had already made his decision. He sat down, opened a channel to the Home Council, and began to speak. The vote on the inspection resolution came 9 days later. In those 9 days, the Galactic Senate became a place of quiet, intense, and almost entirely invisible warfare. Not the kind with weapons. The kind with words and promises and carefully shared information, and the slow, grinding pressure of one government on another. The kind of warfare that most species considered civilized. The kind that humans, it turned out, were also extremely good at. Krethshal of the Mrak Dominion had spent those 9 days working. The Mrak were natural coalition builders. They had held their vast insectoid empire together for 8,000 years through a mastery of political leverage that even the oldest Senate members respected. Krethshal called in old debts. He made new offers. He personally visited the delegations of 42 smaller states and made the case that the human construction in the outer Veil was not just a territorial question. It was a question of precedent. If one new species could build a military superstructure in unclaimed space and face no accountability, then the entire framework of galactic order was weakened. It was a good argument. It was, in fact, a correct argument. But the Draconid Imperium had also been working. Ambassador, Vethkal was not a natural politician in the way Krethshal was. He was a diplomat, which was a different thing. Politicians built coalitions by telling people what they wanted to hear. Diplomats built coalitions by telling people what they needed to know. Vethkal spent those 9 days sharing information, carefully selected, precisely targeted information, with the delegations of the states he thought mattered most. He did not share the full technical specifications the humans had provided. He shared something more useful, context. He sat with the Valhari Collective's senior delegate and talked for 4 hours about the history of human conflict on their home planet, drawing on the detailed cultural briefings the human delegation had supplied. He met with the ambassador of the Les Federation, a small but strategically significant state that had been leaning toward supporting the Mrak resolution, and described, in measured terms, what General Hale had told him about the Outer Veil installations. Not threatening, not boasting, explaining the vote, when it came, was close. Closer than the Mrak Dominion had expected. The inspection resolution failed by 11 votes. In a chamber of 40,000 delegates representing 800 species, 11 votes was a razor's edge. Krethshal stood in the chamber when the count was announced and was completely still for a long moment. The Mrak equivalent of visible shock dot in the human delegation's seats. There was no visible reaction at all. Vasquez sat with her hands folded. Hale looked at the vote board, then looked away, calm. But the story did not end with the vote. 3 weeks after the Senate session closed, a MRAC military patrol vessel entered the outer edge of the contested drift, a region of space that abutted the human territorial registration line, but had never been formally assigned to any state. The MRAC filed the transit with the Senate's route registry as a routine navigation exercise. What it actually was, the human early warning arrays detected within 6 minutes of the vessel crossing the threshold. A sensor sweep, detailed, precise, and directed at the nearest human installation in the outer veil. The human response came 40 minutes later. Not a weapon, not a warning shot. A communication sent directly to the MRAC patrol vessel's command deck, in the MRAC primary language, without going through Senate translation systems. The message was brief. It said, "We see you. We have always seen you. Please return to your registered territory." The patrol vessel turned around immediately. The message, however, did not stay private. It arrived at the MRAC Dominion's military command with a secondary file attached, a detailed record of exactly how much the human arrays had seen during the patrol vessel sweep. Not just the vessel's position, its internal power readings, its crew count, estimated from heat signatures, its sensor array model, identified from its emission pattern. The secondary file also contained, and this was the part that Crethshall reviewed 4 times before he believed it, a complete record of 15 previous MRAC surveillance operations in the border region, dating back 18 months. Operations the MRAC had conducted with what they believed was total deniability. The humans had logged all of them, every single one, and said nothing. Until now, Crethshall convened an emergency session of the Dominion Strategic Council. The session lasted 6 hours. At the end of it, the Council had agreed on 2 things. First, that the human surveillance detection capability was significantly beyond anything the Dominion's intelligence services had assessed. Second, that the decision to send a patrol vessel toward human installations 3 weeks after a failed Senate resolution had been, in retrospect, poorly conceived. The Council's senior intelligence director, a veteran officer named Vreth Kaul Das, who had spent 40 years studying potential threats to the Dominion, submitted a separate report that same day. It was not a long report, but it was the kind of report that, once circulated, changed the direction of conversations. Vreth Kaul Das had spent the 3 weeks since the Senate session studying everything the Dominion's intelligence network had accumulated about humans. Not their diplomacy, not their culture, their military history. He had read translated accounts of their ancient wars. He had read strategic analyses of their most recent large-scale conflict, the one they called the Final War, which had ended 8 decades ago and which had killed, by conservative estimate, 300 million human beings in 4 years. He had read about the weapons they had built during that war, weapons that were never used, because both sides understood that using them would mean there was no side left to win. His report said, "We have been making a category error. We have been treating the humans as a new civilization that has recently developed space capability. They are not that. They are an ancient warrior culture that has recently developed space capability. The difference is significant. A new civilization in space is uncertain, cautious, learning its limits. An ancient warrior culture in space already knows its limits precisely, because those limits were established over thousands of years against opponents who are trying to kill them. They did not bring uncertainty into this galaxy. They brought experience." He had added one more line at the end of the report. It read, "Recommend, do not probe further. Recommend, open direct diplomatic channels with human military leadership. Reason, we need to understand what they consider a proportionate response before we accidentally find out." The report was classified immediately. It was also, within 48 hours, read by every senior official in the MRAC Strategic Council. And then, quietly, through channels that were not officially acknowledged, a copy reached the desk of Chorus of Still Waters, Grand Arbiter of the Galactic Senate. She read it once. Then she sent a private communication to Ambassador Vasquez, requesting a meeting, not a formal Senate meeting, not a recorded session, but a quiet conversation between two individuals in a small room, without observers. Vasquez accepted within the hour. The meeting took place in a room at the top of the Senate's northern tower, which had a view that looked out across the city planet's skyline, towers and lights, and the distant shine of ships moving through the upper atmosphere. Chorus of Still Waters arrived alone. Vasquez arrived with General Howe. The Grand Arbiter looked at the general for a long moment after they sat down. She had served in her role for almost 400 years. She had seen empires collapse and new species rise. She had watched civilizations that thought themselves unassailable discover otherwise. She was not easily unnerved. She said, "I have read a document that has changed my understanding of your people. I want to know if the analysis is correct." Hale said, "That depends on the document." She told him what it said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The analysis is correct, mostly. There are a few points where the author underestimated, rather than overestimated." The Grand Arbiter was silent for a long time. The lights of the city moved outside the window. Finally, she said, "When the Human Confederation registered its territorial claims 2 years ago, the Senate's Assessment Committee classified your civilization as an emerging mid-tier power. Standard protocol for a young spacefaring species." "Yes," Hale said, "that classification is wrong." "Yes," he said again. She looked at him steadily. "Why did you not correct it?" He met her eyes. "Because we were still learning what kind of galaxy this is. We needed time to understand our neighbors before our neighbors understood us. 2 years is not very long, but it was enough." The Grand Arbiter turned to look out the window. Her 6 arms were folded in a posture that Veth Kal, had he been present, would have recognized as the Valerie expression of deep, careful thought. "What do you want?" she asked. "Not what does the Human Confederation want. What do you want?" "The same thing you want," Hale said. "A galaxy where nobody has to find out what we're actually capable of." The galaxy did not change overnight. It never does. Civilizations that have spent thousands of years building their assumptions do not abandon them because of a single Senate session or a quiet conversation in a high tower. The shift was slower than that. Slower, and in many ways more interesting. What changed first was the intelligence reports. Every major power in the Galactic Senate had intelligence services. Some were old and elaborate, built across centuries of careful operation. The Kasari had analysts who had been studying political patterns for 3,000 years. The Valhari Collective maintained a network of information brokers that touched nearly every inhabited system. The Mrak Dominion had the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus in the known galaxy, or so they had believed. All of these services, in the months following the Senate session, began quietly redirecting significant resources toward one subject: humans. What they found was not what they expected. They expected to find a young civilization with some interesting military history and an unusually aggressive posture for a species at its developmental stage. What they found instead was a civilization that had been, in the 2 years since first contact, systematically and patiently collecting information about every major power in the Senate, their military capabilities, their political structures, their economic dependencies, their historical conflict patterns, and the specific personalities of their senior decision-makers. The collection was not sloppy. It was not accidental. It was the work of people who knew exactly what they were doing and had been trained by institutions that had been refining this particular skill for a very long time. The Kasari. Intelligence Directorate's summary report described it as the most thorough strategic assessment of the galactic political landscape ever conducted by a newly contact species by a margin that is difficult to quantify. The MRAC equivalent report used language that was more direct. They knew more about us than we knew about them before the first diplomatic handshake. We do not know how. General Hawley, had he been shown that report, could have explained how. He would have pointed out that humans had been intercepting and analyzing the MRAC's own surveillance signals for 14 months before the Senate session, using the same arrays that had logged the patrol vessel's intrusion. He would have noted that the MRAC's communication encryption was based on mathematical principles that human cryptographers had encountered in a different form during their own late industrial era and had developed tools to address. He would have said all of this pleasantly and without hostility because it was simply true, and because he believed, as he had always believed, that clarity was more useful than comfort. But Hawley was not shown the report. He was in the outer veil. 3 months after the Senate session, Hawley had returned to the installation network with a team of engineers. The work that continued there was not secret. The Human Confederation had, in keeping with the agreement made with the Draconid Imperium, filed updated construction registrations with the Senate's Territorial Oversight Office. What was registered was accurate. It was simply not complete. The portions of the installation network that existed in sensor shadow zones, positioned in the gravitational interference fields of 2 brown dwarf stars, remained unregistered because they remained, as far as the Senate's detection systems were concerned, undetected. Hawley walked the corridors of the primary station, a structure the size of a small moon, though its external profile was designed to read much smaller on long-range sensors, and thought about the conversation he'd had with the Grand Arbiter. He thought about it often, in the quiet between briefings and inspections, and the 10,000 small decisions that went into maintaining a network of installations across 6 star systems. "What do you want?" she had asked. He had answered honestly, "The same thing you want. A galaxy where nobody has to find out." He still believed that. He believed it the way he believed most things, not with idealism, but with the clear-eyed pragmatism of someone who had spent his life studying conflict and its consequences. He did not want a war. He had never wanted a war. He had devoted his entire career to making sure that the people who might start wars understood, with perfect clarity, what the cost would be. That was the thing about deterrence. It only worked if the other side believed it. And the other side only believed it if they had enough information to make an accurate assessment. So you gave them the information, carefully, precisely, enough to be convincing. Not so much that it became a provocation. It was a balance. Humans had spent centuries learning to walk. Ambassador Vasquez, meanwhile, was doing something that no one in the Senate had expected. She was making friends, not the political kind of friends, not the transactional partnerships that the Senate ran on, where support for one resolution was traded for favorable tariff terms on another. She was making the personal kind. She attended cultural events hosted by the Valhari Collective and asked genuine questions about their music, which operated on harmonic principles that no other species had ever fully understood. She learned 17 words in the Kessari's primary ceremonial language and used them correctly in a formal dinner setting, which caused the Kessari ambassador to stare at her a full 10 seconds before responding. She visited the Draconid Imperium's home system on a personal trip, not a diplomatic mission. A personal trip, and spent a week touring its ancient sites with Ambassador Vethkal as a guide. These were small things, but they accumulated. The Senate session the following year was different from the one before it. The agenda was routine. Territorial disputes in the Middle Rim, a trade agreement between 3 mid-tier powers, a review of environmental protection standards for newly discovered biospheres, The human delegation attended. They sat in their section. They participated in the debates in a measured, well-prepared way that the Senate's longer-serving delegates had begun to recognize as characteristic. What was different was the way people looked at them. It was not fear, exactly, though fear was part of it. Quiet and carefully managed. It was more like the adjustment that comes when you realize that the person you had categorized as a minor figure in a room is actually one of the most important people in it, and has been for some time, and the only thing that changed is your understanding of that fact. Every delegation in the chamber had read intelligence reports by then. Every delegation had done its own assessment. The assessments differed in specifics, but agreed on the broad shape of things. The humans were not what the Senate had assumed. They were something older and stranger, and more carefully controlled than anyone had initially understood. And the control, that was perhaps the most remarkable part. Because the intelligence reports all noted the same thing, approached from different angles, the humans were capable of significantly more than they had shown, and they were choosing, deliberately and consistently, to show less. Not because they were hiding, but because they understood that the galaxy did not yet know how to process what they were, and they were giving it time to learn. Crethshall had eventually read Vrethkal Das's original report. He had sat with it for a long time. And then, in a move that surprised his own council, he had requested a private meeting with Ambassador Vasquez. Not to negotiate, not to establish leverage. To talk, Vasquez had accepted. They met in a small dining room in the Senate's hospitality, quartered and ate food from their respective cuisines and talked for 3 hours. Vasquez learned that Crethshall had 7 children, and that Mruk family structure was built around the eldest child's profession. His eldest had become a mathematician, which in Mruk culture was considered the highest intellectual calling. Crethshall learned that Vasquez had grown up in a city that sat on the edge of a large ocean, and that she had wanted to be a marine biologist before she decided that diplomacy was where she could do the most good. At the end of the 3 hours, Crethshall said, "I want to understand something." The general's statement in the Senate chamber, was it scripted? Prepared in advance? Vasquez considered this. The words were his own. The decision to say them was prepared in advance. It was intended to land exactly as it did. Yes. Crethshall was quiet for a moment. My intelligence director told me I should not probe further, that I should open direct channels with your military leadership before I accidentally found out what a proportionate response looks like. He looked at her steadily. I found that advice alarming, coming from a man who has spent 40 years being alarmed by nothing. Vasquez nodded. Is it accurate? She thought about how to answer this. Then she said, I think the most honest thing I can tell you is that we have never wanted to demonstrate what a proportionate response looks like. And we have structured everything we have done since first contact around making that demonstration unnecessary. She paused. The general's goal in that chamber was not to threaten. It was to prevent. Everything we have built, every piece of information we have shared, every conversation like this one, it's all the same goal: prevention. Crethshall looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, that is either the most reassuring thing I have heard since the Senate session, or the most frightening. I have not yet decided which. Vasquez smiled, the small, calm smile that Vrethkal had noticed on the first day. I know, she